Good afternoon and welcome to the last event of the day. And we are so thrilled to have you back with us for our very exciting afternoon with Rabbi Laura Geller. It is really my honor and my privilege to be able to welcome her with us this afternoon, all the way from California. And it's very nice of her to be able to spend the afternoon with us. I've been a big fan of Rabbi Geller's from the days of the Jewish catalog book when I was teaching Sunday school back in the day and working with uh, little ones in day camp. So this is very exciting for me to get to spend the time with her and to spend the time with you on this. So without further ado, I'm going to have the privilege of introducing you all to Rabbi Laura Geller. Rabbi Geller is Rabbi Emerita of Temple Emmanuel of Beverly Hills, twice named one of Newsweek's 50 most influential rabbis in America, was named by PBS Next Avenue as one of the 50 2017 influencers in aging. Prior to becoming one of the first women to be selected through a national search to lead a major metropolitan synagogue, Rabbi Geller served as the director of Hillel of University of Southern California for 14 years and as the Pacific Southwest region's executive director of the American Jewish Congress for 4 years. She was featured in the PBS documentary Jewish Americans. Author of numerous articles and books and journals, she was one of the editorial board of the Torah, a woman's commentary. She serves as a fellow of the Corporation of Brown University, from where she graduated in 1971. In addition, she serves on the board of Encore.org and the Jewish Women's Archive. Ordained by Hebrew Union College in 1976, she is the third woman in the Reform movement to become a rabbi. It is my privilege and honor to welcome Rabbi Laura Geller to Active Learners Day, Toledo, Ohio. Welcome, Rabbi.
It's delightful to be here, and it sounds like it's been a really terrific day so far. As you've focused on two very important dimensions of being Jewish, community and food, very important to us. And I'm delighted to be part of a discussion of other things that are important to us as well. I want to start by thanking the Jewish Living Center of Greater Toledo for bringing me into your community and into your homes, and also for the gift of the book that my late husband and I wrote that many of you have received. So I want to thank the Jewish Living Center for that gift. And particularly, I'd like to thank Renee Rusko for helping me understand a little bit about your community and shaping this talk in a way that I hope will be most meaningful to all of us. So I want to start by reminding you of a classic Jewish text that some of you know, Pirkei Avot, usually translated as sayings of the fathers or saying of the ancestors, but maybe better translated as essential teachings. And in this little tractate of the Mishnah from about the 2nd century of the Common Era, there's a description of a life. Now, this is probably a fantasy description because people didn't live as long as it suggests that they did. But here's the text. He used to say, at 5 years, the study of scripture, at 10, the study of Mishnah, at 13, subject to the commandments. This, by the way, is where we get the idea of a bar mitzvah at 13. At 15, the study of Talmud, at 18, the bridal canopy, at 20, for the pursuit of livelihood, at 30, the peak of strength, at 40, wisdom, at 50, able to give counsel, at 60, for zikna. Zikna, the word same root as beard, usually translated as old age, but in one commentary translated as one who has acquired wisdom. At 70, for seva. Seva probably means the fullness of age. We see the word again in Psalm 92. The righteous will blossom like a date palm. They will still be fruitful in seva, in the fullness of age. They will be full of sap and juicy. So that's 70. At 80, the age of strength. At 90, a bent body. At 100, as good as dead and gone completely out of the world. Now, many of you know that when somebody has a birthday, you say, Ad mea ve'esrim, you should live to be 120. This is how long Moses, according to the tradition, lived. But clearly from this text, you don't really want to wish anybody to live to 120, right? At 100, as good as dead and gone completely out of the world. Now people, instead of saying Ad mea ve'esrim, you should live to 120, the new way of saying that is you should live Ad mea ka'esrim. You should live to 100 as though you were still 20, energetic, engaged, curious. But notice the stages. There's the first stage. It's about learning. The second stage, the bridal canopy, the pursuit of livelihood, it's about building a career and having a family. The third stage, where many of us on this call are located, is about wisdom, counsel, fullness of age, and strength. And the fourth stage, beginning to let go, preparing for death. It'd be interesting if we had more time to actually take some time and talk with each other about how we describe the stages of our life. How would our description be different from this second century description? But the idea that life unfolds in stages and we need to notice the work of those stages is an important part of thinking about getting good at getting older. I want to ask you to think for a moment about how you think about this stage of your life. Most of us are in the stage between building our careers and raising our families and frail old age. And it turns out that this is actually a new stage of life. We're living 30 years longer than our grandparents did. And it's not that those 30 years are tacked on to the end of our life. It's not that we'll be frail old agers for 30 years at the end of our life. It's that there's this new stage in between that didn't exist before. Now, the idea that stages are not biologically given, but rather socially constructed, really makes sense when you think about adolescence. It turns out that the word adolescence didn't first appear in the psychological literature until 1920. Why is that? Because there wasn't adolescence before then. People were children and then they were grown-ups. But now there's adolescence. There's another new stage. It's called emerging adulthood. It's when our millennial kids, some of them after college, come home and live with us. They're not fully ready to launch yet. That's also different from many of us when we were at that chronological age. And similarly, this stage of being an active older adult, no longer working, no longer in the business of raising our family, but still active, engaged in the world, what do we call ourselves? So I'd like to ask you to take a minute and put in the chat how you call yourself. Do you call yourself a senior? Do you call yourself an elder? What do you call yourself? And I'm going to ask Renee to take a look at the chat and perhaps read some of the words that you put in. How do you call yourself, and how would you want this cohort to be called? If the Jewish Living Center is doing programs for your cohort, what do they call them? What should it be called? So people want to put something in the chat? Anybody? And Renee, you're going to read them out loud?
Role model, golden ager, retired, happy, fulfilled bubby,
How many of you like the word elder? Raise your hand. Are there people with hands raised? I'm having trouble seeing the whole screen. Yes, no?
Uh, Maybe one.
Could we ask that one to put in the chat or maybe unmute for a moment and say why you like the word elder?
Somebody said a new chapter. Somebody said, I refer to myself as a senior, but only have really felt like a senior in the past several months due to some physical issues.
So it's interesting that senior, in a way, evokes being old. Seniors in high school were the oldest ones in high school. On the other hand, we like those. Remember in the olden days when you could still go to movies. We liked those senior discounts, didn't we? Right. So an active senior, that's an
Active.
interesting way to
Yep.
call it. Back to the question of elder. It turns out that our tradition, along with other religious traditions, think of being an elder as an honorable status. You would aspire to be an elder. But now people don't aspire to be elders. Why? Because it sounds too much like elderly. So there's a tension in how we think about ourselves. And if you can't name under construction, that's lovely. If you can't name this stage, it's hard to kind of get your mind around it for ourselves as individuals and for us as a cohort. Other words that are used, retired, except that only works for people that actually worked, rewired, seasoned. The word that I actually like the best is one that was coined by Dr. Laura Carstensen at the Stanford Center on Longevity. She calls this cohort perennials. Still blooming, some years not so good, some years better, but still blooming, still with juice and energy and still bending towards the sun. Um, it's important that we recognize that this stage that we are in is not just about us. Often the stage is referred to as boomers. Well, boomers is a technical category, people born between 1946 and 1964. Some of us on the call are boomers, some of us are not boomers, but if we just think of ourselves as boomers, then what we're not paying attention to is that we are not, it's not just about us. We are creating a new life stage. And someday our millennial children, if we have them, will be in this age cohort. And how we create this new life stage that didn't exist before is going to be important for how the generations that come after us move into this stage when their time comes. This is not a chronological age, it's a life stage. And while we have a lot in common, it's very important to acknowledge that we're not all the same. Some of us are healthy and still very active. Others of us wrestle with physical challenges, with disabilities, with illness, with caregiving. Some of us are parents of adult children. Some of us are grandparents. Some of us don't have kids or grandchildren, or perhaps don't have the kinds of relationships that we wish we did with children and grandchildren. Some of us are solo agers. Some of us never partnered, or some of us partnered and then divorced, or now are widow or widowers. Some of us are straight. Some of us are LGBTQ. Some of us have discretionary resources, and others of us worry about financial futures. It's very important that we notice that we are a very diverse group, even as we see how much we have in common. So what we're doing at this stage of our life is reimagining a life stage, but we're also reimagining a lifespan. Demographers predict that children who are born since 2000 will live to be 100. Children that are born in 2007 will live to be 104. But most of the policies that we live in were put in place for very different assumptions about the age of our population. Think about it. Life expectancy 5,000 years ago was 18. In the early 1900s, it reached 47. The reason that Social Security starts at 65 is that people didn't used to live much more than 67. All of that has changed. Dr. Carstensen, who I mentioned before, says it's time to get serious about a major redesign of life. In her view, the tension surrounding aging is due largely to the speed with which life expectancy increased. Long lives are not the problem. The problem is that we're living in a culture that was designed for lives half as long as the ones that we're living. Think about it, retirements that span 4 decades. I mean, that wasn't possible for my grandfather or even for my dad. Education that ends in the early 20s. It makes sense, not so much anymore. Now I have a lot of time and energy. Why shouldn't I be going to college now or going back to college now? Social norms that dictate intergenerational responsibilities are changing as well. So we are at a moment when we need to ask different kinds of questions. How do traditional models of education, of work, of lifestyles, of social relationships, of financial planning, of healthcare, of early childhood, and intergenerational compacts need to change in order to support long lives? All of you might have seen that in last week's New York Times, in the business section, there was an article that was entitled, "What You Will Need If You Live to Be 100." It focused on a young couple in their 30s who were reimagining retirement planning, not just as retirement planning, but as longevity planning, combining conventional financial techniques with thinking about life planning. And the article, and here I'm quoting, "In developing a core life planning philosophy, you have to ponder answers to 3 questions. What do you want out of life? What gives you joy? And how do you pay for it? What do you want out of life? What gives you joy? And then in the business section, how do you pay for it?" The article goes on to say purpose and meaning throughout life are important, although it's hard to pin down exactly how they improve longevity. And then it refers to a study that was published in 2013 that suggests that these factors may offer a mental and possibly a physical breakwater for lives that include hard times. Having purpose in life may motivate reframing stressful situations to deal with them more productively, thereby facilitating recovery from stress and trauma. This is the New York Times business section talking about lives of purpose, what brings joy. These are really challenging questions in our world, and they're also important questions in our Jewish community as we think about the future. We are pioneers at getting good, at getting older. And that's what the book that I want to talk about is about. Almost 50 years ago, when I was an undergraduate, there was a revolution that was taking place in the Jewish world. I wasn't active in creating the revolution, but it was part of the reason I ended up going to rabbinical school in 1971. The revolution was energized by the beginning of the Jewish counterculture, and it was captured a few years later by a book that was modeled after the Whole Earth Catalog, which was called The Jewish Catalog, a do-it-yourself kit. Here's the book. Just a show of hands, how many of you remember the book? Can you raise your hands? Again, Renee, give me a sense of how many people have their hands raised.
A lot.
A lot. It was a pretty important book. It actually sold more copies for the Jewish Publication Society of a book. It was the second largest selling book they ever published. The first was the Hebrew Bible. It was a pretty important book that caught a generation, and it didn't create a change, but it kind of captured a change that was going on in Jewish life as baby boomers, us, were empowered to, here's what the introduction says, take back Judaism from the staid hands of our elders and reshape it for our own times. And the book offered tools to take responsibility for our own Jewish lives. You didn't need rabbis. You could really do it yourself. Some of you may even have used the challah recipe in it the first time you ever tried to bake challah. Well, the co-author of that book was my late husband, Richard Siegel. I didn't know him then. We got married years later. That was the 60s and 70s. And now we, many of us, are in our 60s and 70s. And Rich felt that we needed another do-it-yourself kit to help us navigate the changes that are part of our lives as we grow older. So that's the first origin story of the book that many of you have, Getting Good at Getting Older. And you notice it looks a little bit like the Jewish catalog. Not accidental, right? We use the same colors, the same form, the same design features inside, because this too is a toolkit, and this too has a sense of humor. The book Getting Good at Getting Older includes irreverent cartoons and some photographs, including my favorite, which is the backside of Maxine Menster's tombstone in Iowa, a recipe for cookies. Apparently, every time someone asked for her cookie recipe, she would say, "Over my dead body." So let me tell you the second reason that Rich and I wrote the book. I was 62, and we were beginning to think about our next stage, contemplating retirement. I was the senior rabbi of Temple Emmanuel of Beverly Hills, a big Reform synagogue in Los Angeles. And I noticed that a huge percentage of congregants were boomers, and many were leaving the congregation. That observation led to a listening campaign where we talked to about 250 congregants in this age cohort, in people's homes, in house meetings. And we asked people, these were small conversations in people's homes facilitated by congregants. We asked people, how do you feel about this stage of life, this stage between maturity, when you built your families, raised in your careers, and frail old age, this stage that didn't exist for our grandparents. So we asked people, now that more years have been added to your life, how do you add more life to your years? What keeps you up at night? What gets you up in the morning? What are your fears? What are your hopes? And we discovered over and over again in these conversations that people had 4 fears. The first fear was becoming invisible. Who am I when I'm no longer the senior rabbi of Temple Emmanuel? Who will see me? The fear of becoming isolated. Our social capital shrinks at this stage in our life. Who are my friends going to be? Being without purpose. Well, what am I going to do all day? And being dependent. God forbid I should ever be dependent, especially on my children. In these conversations, people shared lots of questions. These were really intimate conversations. Questions like, how do I navigate changing relationships with my older parents, with my millennial children, with my intimate partners, and in particular, with friends? How do I nurture long-term friendships? How do I let go of toxic friendships? Now that I know there's less time ahead than there was behind, do I still want to have people in my life who suck energy from me? And how do I make new friends at this stage of my life? And that led to other kinds of questions. As friends move away, kids too, with whom do I want to grow old? And in what kind of setting? Do I want to move to a retirement community? Do I want to move to be near my kids? Do I want to age in place? And if I do want to stay in my own home, what kinds of changes do I need to make in my community in order to make that possible? As an aside, that question led to the creation of a very wonderful, innovative project called Chai Village LA, which is the first synagogue village. A village, not a physical place, but a geographical area where people are creating different kinds of relationships with each other in order to stay in their own homes. And we're doing that in a partnership between two synagogues. I can talk more about that in questions. Other kinds of issues that emerged. How do I deal with illness, my own or that of my friends? We all know that throughout our life, people get sick, but more people get sick as we get older. I don't know about you, but I have a rule with my friends that we can only go through the organ recital for 5 minutes. What's the organ recital? When everybody goes around and talks about what's wrong with each of their organs. We do that for 5 minutes and then we move on to whatever it is that we're going to talk about. What do I need to do to get ready for the inevitable? Those end of life conversations that we know we need to be having with our adult kids. If we don't have adult kids, with whom do we have them? These are questions that kept coming up. Other kinds of questions. What will give meaning to my life now that I no longer work full time? How can I find a volunteer or a paid position to which I can bring my experience, my talent, my passion? And then there were questions about legacy. What lives on after me? And the really difficult question, what do I do now that I know that my kids don't want my stuff? What am I going to do with all of that stuff? Finally, the question that really connected to me, how can Jewish wisdom, spiritual practice, help me get good at getting older? One of the blessings of being in a congregation is that there are people in my life who are older than I am. I'm 70 now, and I have friends who are 85 and 90. And like Estelle Reiner in that movie, When Harry Met Sally, when she points and says, I want what she's having. Well, I know people, I want what they're having. How do I, a 70-year-old, get to be that 85-year-old, that 90-year-old? What do I have to start to do now to help me become that person? And how can Jewish tradition and spirituality help me deal with that? Those questions became the table of contents for the book that some of you have in your hands, Getting Good at Getting Older. And like the Jewish catalog, it is a toolkit. There are 6 sections in the book: getting good at gaining wisdom, getting good at getting along, getting good at getting better, getting good at getting ready, getting good at giving back, and getting good at giving away. And each section in the book offers actual tools and resources that will help you find your own answers to those questions. It's not a book that you read from beginning to end. It's not a book that's a sermon. It's not going to say, teach us to number our days so that we may get a heart of wisdom, although that's important. It's specifically, your millennial kid is coming home, what should the rules be? Or it's time to have that conversation about end of life directives, how you want to be treated as you are dying, but nobody wants to talk to you about it, or you don't really want to talk about it either. How do you actually have those conversations? Most of the book Rich and I wrote ourselves, but in many of the sections we asked people who know more than we to share their wisdom. And for example, that section about talking about things you don't want to talk about was written by the people that created the Conversation Project, which is a national program, not Jewish, to help people around the country begin to have those conversations. It was interesting in the listening campaign, the majority of my congregants had end of life directives, but a very small percentage of them had actually had talked about them with their adult children. So those of you that have end of life directives, if you don't, you should. And if you do, have you had those conversations? And if not, how are you going to do it? So the book was published in before the pandemic. That was a lifetime ago. it was before people in our age cohort were afraid that we wouldn't have the opportunity to get good at getting older. But the world has completely changed since then. And yet the issues the book deals with are more relevant than ever. Ironically, now, because of the pandemic, all the issues that are part of our lives are actually more urgent. First is the issue of ageism, the only acceptable ism in our society. You know, people, nice people, still have negative stereotypes about older people. We all know those Hallmark cards that kind of make fun of people in our age cohort. It also manifests itself in pervasive unemployment discrimination, biased healthcare, media caricatures, or real invisibility. Ageism is real. It's even more, we're more aware of it now because of the pandemic. We're also more aware, I think, of internalized ageism, the ageist view that we have of ourselves that lead to negative mental and physical health. You all know what I'm talking about. We all say 70 is the new 50. But the truth is, that's just a way of denying that we're getting older. The pandemic makes it impossible to deny that we're getting older. Even those of us who were denying that we were getting older, we can't do that anymore because it's really a frightening time to be an older adult, because older adults, as we all know, are particularly vulnerable. In addition to that, the response to the pandemic really has revealed that stereotypes and these ageist attitudes about us, about aging, not only persist, but in some ways have gotten worse. You know, at the beginning of the pandemic, there was a meme, hashtag boomer remover. This morbid attitude that the deaths of active older adults doesn't really matter. There was a real sense that the interests of the older and younger segments of our population are pitted against one another, particularly in debates about curbing the spread of the virus. So that's actually happening now much more explicitly than before the pandemic. And yet at the same time, this is a new generational moment. I couldn't have gotten through the first 3 months of the pandemic if my stepdaughter wasn't willing to go shopping for me. I needed her. And I needed to say, I need you. And she needed me in a different way because she needed to see the resilience that comes from having life experience and from me being able to say to her, Gam ze ya'avor, this too shall pass. We could have conversations that we wouldn't have had been able to have before. And me with my own kids who don't live in Los Angeles. The pandemic was for many of our children their first serious encounter with health challenges that we face that we might not have been sharing with them. And we pretended, at least I did, that, you know, I didn't really, everything was fine and I acted young and I looked young and I didn't share my own concerns about my own slowing down. But now our kids worry about us. And now we are more able to acknowledge our internalized ageism and beginning to admit that we need help and that there are important conversations that we need to be having with our adult children or the adults in our lives who love us. The values, and also for some of us, many adult children have moved back to their parents' homes, sometimes bringing grandchildren with them. I mean, this is a whole new world for many of us. The values and possibilities of intergenerational connections have never been more clear. You know, as Jews, we often think about intergenerational connections as lador vador, from generation to generation. But now I think we are understanding that it's not from us to them. It is dor vador, generations with generations. How do we capitalize on that new reality to imagine different kinds of multi-generational possibilities after the pandemic is over? The third issue that has been really lifted up because of the pandemic is the truth of loneliness and isolation. It's always been true. As you get older, it's way more true now, and it's only been made worse by sheltering at home. Loneliness and social isolation can be as damaging to health as smoking 15 cigarettes a day, and the problem is particularly acute among us. But loneliness does go across generations. 2 in 5 Americans report that they sometimes or always feel that their social relationships are not meaningful, and 1 in 5 say they feel lonely or socially isolated. And we all know that the lack of connection can have life-threatening consequences. Studies show that chronic loneliness has clear links to an array of health problems, including dementia, depression, anxiety, self-harm, heart condition, and substance abuse. And people without social support also have a lower chance of full recovery after a serious illness. I could just cite lots and lots of statistics, but you all know the truth of loneliness. And was always real, but people wouldn't talk about it. I would never have admitted loneliness, but now it's just so obvious. It turns out that the United Kingdom under Margaret Thatcher actually appointed a minister of loneliness before the pandemic. Loneliness was and still is a public health emergency. How do we create social policy that mitigates the difficulty of this pandemic of loneliness? That's a really important issue that after the pandemic is over, people, I think, are going to be able to pay more attention to. The fourth issue is the importance of technology. Many of us in our age cohort, not digital natives, are new to the technology that has really been so life-sustaining through this pandemic. And in the world that we're going to enter into, the new normal, the hybrid world, technology will continue to play a really important part. It's important to notice that it is a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it creates the possibility for connectedness. On the other hand, there's evidence of a loneliness paradox, where tech and social media that should make us more socially connected actually increase loneliness. How are we going to deal with this in our new hybrid world? All of us know about Zoom fatigue. I'm grateful that you're here on the call. I mean, you've been on zillions of Zoom calls over the past year. Zoom life cycle ceremonies, thank God for them. But at the same time, as wonderful as a Shiva Minyan is, where you can have family and friends from around the world, what you really need is a hug and a regalach. How are we going to create this hybrid world? So those are all ways that the pandemic has lifted up the issues that all of us deal with. Let me just take a few more minutes and say a few things that I learned that were a surprise in the writing of the book. The first is how important friends are as we get older. Betty Friedan in 1993 wrote a book called The Fountain of Age. She was one of the first people to actually name the issues that will be emerging at this stage of our life. Here's what she wrote. More and more, psychologists have found that for older persons, loneliness is not necessarily linked to the death of a spouse or to how infrequently they see their children or grandchildren, but to the absence of personal relationships with peers, friends of their own age or any age, who share their interests and with whom they sustain their roots of shared experience. So I think that's a pretty important insight. I think as a Jew, it is a particularly important insight because our tradition acknowledges certain categories of mourners: parents, children, spouses, and siblings, but doesn't acknowledge the truth that friends are also mourners. How do we mourn the death of a friend, particularly if that friend dies in a place far away from us and we can't go to a funeral? How should Jewish tradition, how should a synagogue, how should we understand the significance of our status as mourners? The second thing I learned writing this, and it became particularly poignant after Richie died, the particular challenges of solo agers, of widows, widowers, divorced folks, people who never married, particularly around end of life issues and questions of with whom do I want to grow old. So that's an issue that it was really important in the learning. And finally, that Jewish tradition really does have wisdom as we negotiate this stage of life. And I want to give you an example of this. You know, our tradition teaches us that divinity, however we understand that, is present at every moment in our life. It's just up to us to acknowledge divinity, that there's something bigger than we are, and we do it by saying blessings. The Talmud tells us that we're supposed to say 100 blessings a day. That is 100 times a day. We stop and say, wow, you know, oh, wow. I'm eating an apple and I look at the apple and I think, whoa, where did it grow? And I say a blessing that it grew on a tree. I think, how did it get from that tree to my hand? All the people whose labor makes my pleasure possible. That's what spirituality is, paying attention. And our tradition tells us that we do it through blessings and through life cycle ritual, through marking moments of transition. And then what you notice is that our tradition has a lot of life cycle ritual at the beginning part of our life. A baby is born, there's a bris or a baby naming. There's maybe a pidyon haben, a redemption of the firstborn son or the firstborn child. There's a bar or bat mitzvah. There's a confirmation. There's a wedding. In some cases, there's a divorce and maybe a second wedding. What is the next life cycle ritual in Jewish tradition after a wedding? It's a funeral. Now that is actually stunning. God willing, I'm going to live more years between my first wedding and my funeral than between when I was born and my first wedding. Why is it that there are no rituals for this stage of our life? The answer probably is, well, we don't need new ritual because we live through them again with children or grandchildren. But that only works if you have children or grandchildren, and it also isn't, as much as I love my kids and my grandkids, I am more than just a mother and a grandmother. I am also a person in the world that has a lot of other things going on. What are the moments in my life at this stage that there might be ritual for? And how do I create that ritual? The book doesn't script them, but it asks you to think about what those moments are and then how you might go about creating those rituals. So I just want to read one quick example. Notice this is not a Jewish example, although the people that are telling the story are Jews who were part of my congregation, but there's nothing Jewish about the ritual. Saying goodbye to the house where you raised your children isn't easy, but it's easier if you actually say goodbye. Our daughter, her boyfriend, my husband, and I walk through the rooms of our home, stopping in each one to share good memories and to honor the room for its service. After our journey through time, space, and love, we shed a few tears, toasted the house, and sent it on its way to shelter and protect a new family. Before this ritual, we were stuck, painfully holding on to the house we had built 27 years before when our daughter was born. But after the ritual, we felt joy and contentment as we realized how rich those years had been and how ready we were to let go and move on. An unforeseen benefit is that our daughter's boyfriend now feels more connected to the life and history of our family and says he can't wait to be part of the new memories we make together in our condo. We can't wait either. So that's an example. I mean, some of us at this stage of our life have downsized, have moved from the homes where we where we raised our families, or some of us helped our parents make that transition. What would it look like to actually honor those transitions and mark them with ritual? How could we take what sometimes is experienced as a loss and transform it into an opportunity for connection, for joy, for optimism? Um, this is all part of getting good at getting older. Um, so maybe I'll stop here and see if there are questions or comments that any of you would like to make.
So at this time, if you have questions, just raise your hand and we can have you unmuted. Okay, Faggy, Zach, if we can, or sorry, Jake, if we can unmute. Go ahead, Faggy. You
Fig,
have to
you just
unmute.
need to unmute in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. There you go.
There you go.
Okay. Rabbi, toda, toda, toda. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I think I'm going next week from 70 to 80. And one of the things that I'm beginning to think about, had losses, everybody else, but I've still had more joy than oi in some of those horrific ois. There is still more joy. I think that you have to get to a certain age to understand what resiliency is. You don't understand resiliency until you've been through a whole lot. And it seems to me, first of all, if there's any people, the Jewish people, who are masters at resiliency, it's us. So I guess where I am now is I just retired, and it is the greatest feeling to let go, partially because of the young man who took my position. I mean, it is such a feeling of freedom. But I guess the question that I have is, how do we as a community, coming from different places, from different, but we all belong around the table, okay? How do we begin to talk to each other about that, about what the new norm is going to be like, what we've learned, what the older ones can do? I love when my grandchildren say, Baba, I'd rather spend time with you than my parents, okay? So I guess what I'm saying to you, taking all of that, how do we begin to talk to each other as a community that we have? We have an amazing community, by the way.
So first of all, almost happy birthday.
Thank you.
You know, one of the things you might think about is how you're going to celebrate turning 80. And remember that in the Pirkei Avot description, this is the stage of your life, not only where you are one who has acquired wisdom, but one who can share that wisdom, but at 80 for strength. What does it mean to say at 80 for strength? It's sort of surprising. You would think it would be at 30 for strength. The Hebrew word is grura, which means like strength. You know, if you see a really young, strong-looking guy, you say, "Is a gever who?" You know, I mean, at 80 for strength, Faggy, this is strength. What does strength mean? Strength means resilience. Strength means being ready, knowing when you need to let go. And maybe it means mentoring the person that took over a position that was once very important to you, and that person will be better because of the connections. This is a moment, I think young people, not just your grandkids, but some young people really do want connections to us olders because they want to learn about resilience. You know, Abraham Joshua Heschel, the famous theologian of the last century, famously said, uh, just getting older doesn't make you wise, but wisdom has something to do with getting older. That there's something about life experience and reflecting on life experience that is a part of wisdom. So what kind of program could the Jewish Living Center add to its opportunities where that youngers and olders could get together? I mean, I mentioned Chai Village LA, this project that of our two synagogues. We are now exploring multi-generational programs, and we have created 4 pilot programs, one of which is a confirmation class at one of our synagogues where there are high school kids, and there are 10 high school kids, and there are 10 olders from the village, and these 20 people together are students in a class. It isn't that the olders are teaching the youngers, they're all together learning together, and the relationships that are developing, and this is all happening over Zoom, which makes it more complicated. The relationship that's developing between these individual youngers and individual olders has been quite miraculous. What are the possibilities? And to not just think about grandparenting, because not everybody is a grandparent, and not everybody has grandkids close enough to be able to, to have that good experience if it's going to be a good experience. It's a great question, and think about how you're going to be celebrating that birthday. Is it something that I don't know if you're a member of a synagogue or not. Do you do it at your synagogue? Do you do it at home? Do you do it, with your friends? I mean, but to think about it, it's an important transition. It doesn't have to happen the day you turn 80, but as you enter that decade, what would you want to model, and with whom, and how would you do it?
Diana,
Diana, you
unmute, please.
need to unmute in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. There you go.
There we go. Okay. My question is, how do you choose which child, I have 3, handles the responsibility at the end? I mean, each child has certain qualities. Some I trust, some I don't trust. But how do you choose without hurting the others?
So this is a really important question. Again, the book does deal with it. There's a chapter that deals with the chapter is about honoring your parents. We're the parents now that need to be honored, and some of these questions come up there at other places in the book. First of all of us need to get ready. That is to say, we need to have all our passwords together. We need to have done an end of life directive. And I think that you guys have done work around this before. Is that true, Renee? Have there been workshops about it? There are lots of good books. One I just heard about called A Better End, which actually specifically tells you all the things that you need to do to get together, and that you need to have a health proxy. You need to have there are categories. And first of all, you and whoever else is, if you're partnered, whoever else you would talk to about it, you need to decide. And then you need to have conversations with your kids. And ideally you have it with all of them together, and you say, Susie, I'm asking you to be the health care proxy because blah blah blah, and that everybody together hears about it, and whatever feelings are raised, and you get to work them out over time before you get to a stage where you can't work them out anymore. Not all families can do that. And one of the suggestions in the book is that sometimes those conversations can be handled better if there's somebody else in the room besides a family person. And there are people who are skilled at this, perhaps your rabbi, to think who in the community could be helpful. And again, there are suggestions in the book about how to do this. The other thing that's important is that you talk to your friends about it and see how they did it. All of us are going through the same stuff, whatever our situation is, and however differently we tweak it. Um, to enable the conversations to take place. It used to be that nobody talked about this stuff. And now it's such a resource that there are on this call, 30 people that you could probably sit down and have a conversation with. Do you know them? If not, is there a way that the Jewish Living Center can bring you together in conversations about this? A silly or not a silly, an example is there are JCCs or synagogues around the country that actually have decluttering groups where people get together and talk about what am I going to do with my grandmother's hutch that I schlepped from Boston to Los Angeles. My kids don't want it. What how do how do I deal with that? Well, I have friends who have figured it out, and I want to hear about that. What are the conversations that you need to have, and how can the Jewish Living Center help you do that? It could easily, and it doesn't have to be 50 people. It could be 3 people or 5 people or whatever. You'll figure this out, and along the way, you'll hurt some people's feelings. There's a section in the book about ethical wills and what forever letters. And one of the questions that often comes up is, I have 2 kids. They're very different from each other. Do I write one forever letter to both of them, or do I write separate ones? And, I've thought about that a lot. And I actually asked my kids, if I were to write you guys separate letters, would you share the letters with each other after I'm dead? Because if that's going to happen, and I don't want it to happen, then it'll change the nature of, you can sort of talk about this, but you have to prepare. You've prepared for everything else in your life. We need to prepare for this stage, and we need to prepare for the letting go part of the stage, which is as we really deal with end of life issues. So really good question, and good luck figuring it out.
Jay and Gail, did you have a question?
Jay, you just need to unmute in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen.
I'll get the
There you
Schwab family group over there next.
My
Nope. Okay.
Okay, I have a suggestion, and I don't know. We have been very lucky, and I don't know how long it'll continue, but we've just been very lucky. We've lived a long time, and we don't have any big issues. And my suggestion on the issue of how you decide who will be the one to deal with your future is to pay attention. Pay attention to your kids. And I say it from this standpoint, we have given up parenting our kids quite a while ago. And what has happened is the kids have turned into parenting us.
That's right.
And also we have arrangements with our kids. We share a house, and they have stepped up and said, I don't want you to be in charge of this house anymore. I'm going to take care of it, and that is the kind of thing that is the message that you don't have anything to worry about, because these kids are looking out for you now. And if you can figure that out, who's looking out for you, and don't tell them what to do anymore, but figure out how you can be more helpful to them, I think is the answer to the future.
So here, this is a good example of sort of on this call, there are people that have responded to these kinds of questions in different ways. Remember, not all of us have such positive relationships with kids. I mean, it's a mixed, we're lucky in different kinds of ways. We are grateful for different kinds of things. But to just raise the question and be able to talk about it and see how different people respond is actually very helpful. None of us are alone in this. These issues are the same, although the family situations are different and therefore the decisions might be different. But, sharing these stories is really, really important. And listen, the idea that we have a lot to be grateful for, what is it about that 85-year-old, that 90-year-old that I want to be like? Gratitude, forgiveness, patience, equanimity, the ability to stay in the present and not be too preoccupied by stuff that went on in the past or stuff that will go on in the future. How do we work on that? As individuals, what kinds of study groups there could be, and what kinds of shared conversations. The most important thing of this stage of our life is to talk to each other and to, again, I said that the issue of loneliness, who will admit that they're lonely? But now you can admit that you're lonely, and now you can, in the beginning of overcoming loneliness is admitting that you're lonely. And and it's certainly an issue for people who are solo agers at this stage of our life. So speaking the truth of our experience is really important, and to be able to do that is really a blessing.
Do we have any other last questions right now? Peggy, let us unmute you.
Rabbi, my father left me an ethical will in Yiddish.
Oh, wow.
It's a treasure. And one of the things my late husband and I have done independently is write ethical wills. And actually, he finished his about a couple of weeks before he passed away. But we haven't, with the kids, opened it yet because we haven't been together, and that's not something we want to do on Zoom. But I urge everyone to take a look at not the money and the houses but what sense of value, what memories, the good and the bad. I highly, highly recommend it. It's an amazing activity for individuals, and I'm waiting, of course, to share that ethical will of Eli's, but Israel here, but we'll get there. But I still have my dad's.
So this is so beautiful to hear. How lucky you are that you have that. The last section of the book actually talks about how you write an ethical will. Maybe you've had classes that offer that. I mean, there are wonderful books, wonderful resources. Take a look at the last chapter in the book, and then think about going to Renee and saying, we want to, organize a class about this. The other thing I want to say to you, Faggy, is as you enter into your 80s, when the pandemic starts to become less of a reality, the idea that you would celebrate this transition with a ritual around not only reading your late husband's ethical will, but sharing your own. I mean, why should they wait until you're not here for them to respond to it? What would a ritual with the people that matter most to you look like, where the focus was sharing that ethical will, maybe beginning with the story of why it meant so much to you that you have your fathers, and also that you could read the Yiddish, or that you could get somebody who could read the Yiddish. I mean, what kind of wonderful story is that about, Jewish continuity and resilience? So this again, I think, supports the notion that thinking about this in terms of ritual, could be very meaningful.
Well, I would just like to take this opportunity. Oops. Okay. I thought I was muted. I would just like to take this
Before
opportunity.
you
Go
do that,
ahead.
let me make one sort of closing comment. Can I?
Sure. Of course you can, Rabbi.
So there are a bunch of secrets to getting good at getting older, besides reading this book and gifting it to your friends. Among the things that you need in order to get good at getting older is you need to have a sense of humor. Because if you don't have a sense of humor, forget it. We think we live in a society that has thought about aging only in terms of decline. We are redefining it to be, there's an upside to it. It's about wisdom. It's about giving back. It's about gratitude. But it's also about maintaining a sense of humor. That's one bottom line. The second bottom line, I said that, one of the 4 fears was becoming dependent. I think the secret to getting good at getting older is to recognize that in our lives, we were never completely independent. We've gone through our lives the different between back and forth between being dependent and being independent. The trick of getting good at getting older is redefining that to discover interdependence. What does it mean to be interdependent? And how do we create communities and relationships that are about interdependence? And finally, I want to say 70 is not the new 50. 80 is not the new 60. 70 is the new 70. 80 is the new 80. How we do this, how we model, how we change this trajectory of the way people think about growing older really matters, not just for us, but for the entire community, Jewish and beyond, and certainly for the people who come after us. So thank you. Listen, I am working now on a book that will deal with creation of new ritual. I'm very curious to know whether any of you have done examples of this, a reaffirmation ceremony, a ceremony for a big birthday, for taking off a wedding ring. I mean, whatever it might have been. I'd love to hear about it. My website is rabbilaurageller.com. If you write to me, I will get back to you because I'm really curious to hear your stories and maybe eventually being able to share your stories with other people's stories, because in a way we're all in this together. So thank you so very much.
I would just like to take this opportunity. I'm going to ask Jake to take everybody off of mute for a minute and just say thank you for sharing your time, your wisdom, your energy and enthusiasm for the aging process, because we are a generation that is aging. We are aging at a fast rate in the United States. We are not getting younger. We are living longer, and we need to age the best lives that we can, because we are here and we are here to stay, and we do have our wisdom of our history of who we are as a Jewish peoplehood to guide us, and it's always been there. It's just how we choose to use it. And I'd like to say thank you for helping us learn that and know that. And Toda Rabbah, and we wish you a wonderful Pesach, and thank you so very much. And thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you, Renee.
Rabbi.
Thank you, Renee.
And to everybody who joined us, thank you
Super.
so very much for spending the day with us.